Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Arena Stage. My name is Seema Sueko, and I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our civil dialogue. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about this program that we're doing. A few months ago, Professor Amitai Etzioni, just behind me and to the right, approached us about would it be possible to do civil dialogues here at Arena Stage? He, I think, like many of us, were feeling like we had become a nation that perhaps had forgotten how to have a civil dialogue. And so he said, is it possible to gather people with diverse perspectives, look at a controversial or difficult topic, and speak civilly, not just speak, but also listen civilly to one another? It seemed like a wonderful connection to our mission as a theater company. When we put on a play, that's exactly what we strive to do. Put on some ideas on stage and create an environment where people have an opportunity to think about those ideas, and hopefully on their drives home, they're sharing diverse perspectives. So this is sort of a test for us to do these conversations outside of the context of a theater production. This is the second of 3 tests. We did one last month focused on privacy and surveillance, and then we have this one today. And on the back of your program, you'll see the next one coming up on May 29th, which is about a very simple topic, exploring the future of race relations in America. We hope you'll join us for that. Since the goal of this is, in fact, dialogue, I thought if you could indulge me for just 30 seconds and turn to somebody near you, but who perhaps you don't know, and just share who you are and why you came here. It's an effort to whet and exercise your dialogue maker. So go ahead and speak with one another just for 30 seconds. Thanks. I heard and saw lots of dialogue making, conversating going on. So without further ado, please let me hand this over to Professor Amitai Etzioni, who will facilitate this for the rest of the evening. Thank you so very much. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, Seema, and the whole Arena staff. It's been a wonderful exercise in collaboration. And as you already heard, we have a dual purpose for each one of these conversations. On the one hand, we want to show that people of different backgrounds and different viewpoints can have a civil conversation. And last time we had one on privacy, which you can find on C-SPAN, which surely met that criteria, and I'm sure we're going to do the same thing today. At the same time, we like to try to illuminate a specific topic. I don't expect that after an hour and a half we can all reach a new shared consensus, but I hope you go home and feel you heard something new and something different and participated in the conversation. Basically, I asked my colleagues to address one question: what we owe other nations. I deliberately used the moral language because we clearly have national interest, and there's nothing wrong with having a national interest. But most of us feel that we also have a moral side. To have this discussion productive, I think we can quickly introduce this in 2 sentences, some guardrails so we won't have to go too far afield. First of all, to argue that we have a moral obligation to do X does not mean that it will always trump all other considerations. So I can imagine that there was a period in which we were terribly dependent on the oil of Saudi Arabia, and that we felt at that time, some people still feel today, that we had to look the other way about the way they violate human rights, because in this case, at least some people held, our national interests had to trump moral considerations. Second, the fact that we intervene someplace, like in Kosovo, doesn't mean we have to intervene every place. Because often people say, well, if you go down that road, there are 50 places in which there are civil wars, there are endless conflicts, we'll spend all our life and all our GDP. and settle. Sometimes it's important to put our foot down, one place, one time, in the hope that other people will get the message. It has some deterrent effect, and not only on the situation itself, but on the other situation. So I asked my colleagues to think about situations like, did we do the right thing in marching into Kosovo? And if yes, why we're not in Rwanda? Do we owe nation after nation foreign aid and political development? Should we intervene in countries which are authoritarian and overthrow the government to promote democratic and human rights the way we did in Libya? And finally, once we are in a country, like we found ourselves in Iraq, in Afghanistan, do we have to follow General Powell's idea that if we broke it, we have to fix it? Means once we overthrow a government in some country, are we morally obligated to also build that country up? These are just some examples of the questions in which the moral issues, what we owe others, come before us. I'm going to, in a moment, ask Wai Wai Nu, who flew all the way from Rangoon to join us, and I'm endlessly grateful to you for the effort and for giving us your time. After she will say whatever she wants to say, exactly what she wants to say, I'll add a few lines, and then I'll call on my colleagues. You have their bios in your program, so I'm just going to introduce them by their names. Would you please?
Thank you, Professor. And thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to the Professor Amitai and the host, the stage itself. And I think it's a very beautiful and important event that they are initiating. Basically, having citizen dialogue. It's the most important thing for open democracy. And I'm so lucky and happy to see this initiative is happening where you are able to really do it. While a country like in Myanmar, coming from Myanmar, there is very little space. There was even no space for the citizen to speak up or to have a dialogue. But now we are having a little bit of space in a way that we are using it very in a precautionary way. So I think this is very important to enrich, and it could basically, become like a practice and example for many other countries like us too. And I think talking about the question which is given to us, what we owe to others, for me, as I would like to come up as individual, from individual experience and individual, perspective as a person, as a youth, as a woman, and I would go beyond to the country level or to the government level, to the people who have authorities. As you may aware, as you can see in my CV, I was a teenage political prisoner. When I was 18, I was arrested by Burmese Myanmar military, and with the whole family. And I thought my life was the worst, and it would never happen. There is nothing else can be worse than this. And when I was inside the prison, I actually met many other young women like me, and I tried to talk with them a lot. I talked many women, maybe more than 500, because I was put up in a prison cell where about 150 women stay. So we have with a very little space to sleep and very, limited, poor infrastructures and living condition, food, health, everything, healthcare, everything. And I talked to these girls, basically, who are similar age. Some of them are a bit older. Some of them are mothers. Some of them are and students, and I try to talk with them. A lot of them, I realize, they don't even know what's happened to them, and many of them basically put in jail, just because of their living conditions or who they are. Like, for example, some of them were put in jail with very little small crimes, which is not a crime in the U.S. Let's say, like gambling or prostitution, stuff like that. And these women actually doesn't know their living condition create them even not able to think of what is their life and what is their hope, what they want to be in the future, when they're supposed to have, dream and hope and missions. They don't have it. And I realized, I think of myself. I know what is happening to me. I was put in jail unjustly by the military, and I know why it's happened. I know what is going to happen in the future, and I know how it will affect my future because I was a student. I basically had to stop my law school. So I know how it will impact to my life. So a lot of these women and girls in the prison, they have no idea what is happening. This is some of the examples that I have experienced, and I felt like, okay, I'm not the worst person because I know what is happening to me. Right? I know what is happening to me and how it will happen. And I know what I want to be and how I want to be doing after I release from the jail, which my sentence was 17 years, basically, on my 18. And after a few years, there was amnesty by the president or, by the government, and we were not included. My family was not included. I was arrested with my father, mother, my sister, my brother, and me, 5 of us. We were not included. At the end, I was like, I lost hope. They are not going to release us, and I have to stay here for 17 years, and I will stay it. If I had to stay for 17 years, I will never ever forgive them. That was I was thinking as a teenager. However, However, luckily we were released in 7 years. So what I have learned from the prison basically was a sense of responsibility, living with other people. For example, when I realized that these women and girls doesn't have a hope or a dream or a future, I thought as a human being, they should have a dream, they should have a hope, they should know what they want to be in the future. They should be able to be doing it because as I want to have a future, they also wanted to have a future. What the difference is, they just don't know. So as a teenager, I was thinking that, okay, I should help them to know what is their future is, what they want to be in the future. And I thought they are more miserable than me. And I thought I should help them. So this is where I got sense of responsibility to the people who are around us. And I took that as a lesson. And when I came out, I really tried to help. And I set up organizations, I become an activist, and I try to help women and girls, men, including male, to really gain, to really empower and to really gain confidence and to really know what they want to know. I help guide them. And this is where, as a personal level, where I get sense of responsibility. On the other hand, I have came to realize how the political system, how the economic system in the country is corrupt and basically failed at this point. And I thought we, as citizens or as a person who is living in that society, we really have to take responsibility to fix this up. If we don't do what others cannot do. At the same time, coming back from the background of the Rohingya community, which is one of the most persecuted ethnic groups in the world, I came to understand the suffering of my own people, and I myself was imprisoned with my family members, with my father, who is a politician, because I was also a Rohingya. So I came to understand that my community's pain and suffering, and I thought I should step in and help for my own community and help for my country, and fix the problem in my country by stepping in. And at the same time, for me, it's really come from the very personal level, communication with the neighbors, with the people around me, with the women around me. So, that's where I really took a stand to really work on the issue, and nowadays it's become a condition that we cannot fix by ourselves. Like living in the Burma, or living in my city in Rangoon, we cannot fix it by ourselves. It's beyond our mandate. It's beyond our capacity, because the issue, the crisis, become international. It's become a humanitarian crisis. It's become a question of humanity, losing humanity. So you may see in the news that the crisis in Burma, the refugee crisis, the persecutions of Rohingya, the persecutions of ethnic minorities, the long-lasting war in Burma, it doesn't disappear with the name of elections or democracy. It actually gets worse under the democratic transformations. And now in 2017, since August 2017, the Bangladesh become the largest refugee camps in the world, which is receiving about 1 million Rohingya refugees from Burma. So before it's become, while I was taking steps, basically, to reduce this crisis, or to help, or to really trying to address the problem domestically, we actually approach the U.S. government. We actually approach international governments, different actors, say this is time to end, address root causes. This is time to end human persecution. This is time to end discrimination. This is time to address root cause. At the same time, this is time to end impunity. It is time to end impunity against abuses against, one human population to another human population. We really called, request back, including U.S. government, and we were told that there is democratic transformation. You have to give time and space. Mm-hmm. The change will not come overnight. But what happened in 2016 in Burma, October, and 2017 August, we have seen change overnight. Within 3 months, more than 500,000 people have to leave their home. They lost everything. They lost their houses, they lost their animals, they lost their pets, they lost their properties, they lost their all belonging. Even they lost their family members, their wife, their mothers, their children. About 390 villages were burned. It is almost like 70% of Rohingyas villages in Burma. And many people were killed, many people were arrested, and there are many uncountable number of interviews and record of sexual abuses, including mutilation. And this has happened overnight. When we asked for that to act on, to help these people, to stop these atrocity crimes, we were told that given time and space, including by the U.S. government. I think it is very important when, as we live, which on the earth as a human society, we cannot live alone. We have to live together, side by side. Human being cannot live alone. They have to live together as a community, as a society, as a family. So we have obligation, responsibility to really protect others who we think others. They are not actually others. They are our human race. Everyone is. If we don't if we see, people human being who looks like different than us as others, then we lost our humanity, basically. And when we lost our sense of belonging, and when we fail to really act, so at this point, and we created the human suffering around the world. Start from history, and in World War II and post World War II, we talk about never again. We have promises, but then we really didn't take the enough effort and responsibility to step in to really stop human suffering and mass atrocities. And today, because of that, we are seeing again. Thank you.
I find it very moving and a nobility of spirit when I was thinking you're going to talk about we owe you, and instead you tell us what you feel you owe others. And that's an incredible measure of your own humanity. So the fact that you tell us in jail what you think about how you can help others, it leaves me very, very moved. And in the second part, where you tell us you don't worry only about your community, but you worry about all abuse, it's to immense credit to you. So usually I wouldn't dare add a sentence to this, but given that I'm a refugee myself, and that most of my extended family perished in concentration camps, I will add a word or two about ethnic cleansing, if you indulge me. So for me, there's a particular scene which was repeatedly reported in the media. Stans kind of gives a kind of a vivid illustration, where when these 390 villages were burned to the ground, one of the Burmese soldiers went into one of those huts. There was a father, a mother, and a baby. He first shot the father in front of the mother. He then raped the mother. He then set the hut on fire and threw the baby into the fire. Now, if that does not move us, if on that one we say, but what else on the news tonight? Or instead we talk about the next tweet, then I don't know if there's a moral bone left in our body. But it's worse, because it's not an isolated incident. Like we have these tragic moments where people go into a primary school and shoot, or to a club. These are individual acts, but this is the state using its modern powers to organize on a large scale this kind of abuse. That's exactly what distinguished the Holocaust from simply pogroms. It was a state machinery. So we cannot let that go by. And there are no complicated factors here. Burma doesn't have oil or rare earth or something we need. It's a two-bit country. It's not complicated like Syria. We should take a clear stand. And for beginning, I think, to close here, we should tell the generals, if they ever leave the little country, we'll hold them until the criminal court in Hague, who is very slow and has very fancy prisons, we'll hold them some other place till the court has time to turn to them. Thank you for indulging me. Esther, would you please?
Good evening. First, thank you so much for bringing us all together for this conversation. Thank you to Arena Stage for providing this cozy environment. I look forward to our conversation with everyone here and everyone around the room. I'd like to maybe pick up on a couple of themes. First, to argue, yes, that all of human society is based on rights and responsibilities, on obligations. And the question is, how do we interpret those? One might see several circles of responsibility: the family, the neighborhood, the city, the country, and beyond. And I think we're looking at exactly how we might apply our understanding of obligations in the larger world beyond. I'll pick up on Amitai's question. You posed several questions to us, and you talked a little bit about the role of foreign aid versus investment. I'm going to turn that around a bit and suggest that we should look very differently at how we think about acting internationally on our obligations. I will say I'd like to highlight two concepts. The first is benevolence, not altruism. Too often when we pick up a newspaper or our media or our tablets, the assumption is that these are in contrast, that acting abroad on behalf of others is only altruistic, a noble value. But I would suggest that the foundation of the post-war order, whether post-Cold War or post-Second World War, was really benevolence, that there's actually shared interests. What's good for me can be good for you as well, and what's good for you can be good for me. So that those who may have a humanitarian response and those who may have a more national security response can agree on certain points. And I would suggest that we want to look particularly at key areas where we can invest in human well-being. It's not one or the other. Precisely in those areas such as education, healthcare, where if we look at, for example, helping countries provide drinking water, helping countries providing electricity so that countries then can engage in their own development is important. So I would separate out and say it's not just as if somehow foreign aid was not supporting foreign policy. So I would suggest that's the first concept to look at. Another is the importance of investing in the future. We will be talking a lot about our obligations now and the current, immediate, heart-wrenching situations. But we also have obligations to the future. We also want to keep that in mind about the choices we make now and the implications in the future. And I would suggest we have to ask, who is the we? Sometimes the we is a national government. There's also roles for private actors, whether non-governmental organizations, universities, corporations, and others. So we want to ask, what are the different roles that different types of we can perform? And again, I would suggest that education is one in particular, and I'd say that you even see this in surprising places, that not only should we be investing, as I say, in human well-being, we should also look at responses to emergencies, of which the refugee crisis is the most significant, and our colleagues have already introduced very poignant examples. As you know, there are about 22.5 million refugees worldwide. There are over 60 million displaced people. But just to talk about refugees, to say that, of course, we developed together, internationally, an international regime on refugees, and I think we need to look, particularly in this country, about how we recommit to support for refugees. Of those 22 million, half are in your case, as in, at the time that you were first arrested, under 18 years old. Half of the refugees are children. And so one of the questions is, how do we think about both how we respond to refugees generally, but the effects, the long-term effects in the future of a generation that sees the world not responding to these huge crises. I would suggest that we are buying conflict in the future by not addressing current refugee issues. So I would suggest recommitting to the refugee regime would be crucial. And I would say, particularly if we say, well, yes, Esther, well, what do you do about it? I would start off with refugee admissions. We are on track, as the United States, to admit the fewest number of refugees since 1980 when we started counting. Traditionally, we've admitted about up to as much as 110,000 refugees. This year, fiscal year, as you know, we all know, good Washingtonians, the fiscal year started last October. This year, we are likely, although this administration capped the level at 45,000, already a dramatic reduction, that we are likely to only admit about half of that. And so at this point, we will have already seen, compared to the fiscal year before, a 74% drop in the number of refugees. So if we're admitting less than, not even up to our cap of 45,000, one thing we could do is actually raise and return to the admission of refugees, of those who are facing the most serious situations. As you know, we have a very extensive and complicated process for being admitted to the United States. I think it works. And so one place we can start when we think about what we owe to others is investments in education, investments in healthcare, and return to support for the refugee regime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, it's very good of Chris to give us an advance notice of his, what he's got to say in the Sunday New York Times.
No, thank you, Amitai, and thank you to the Arena Stage for organizing this. Before I start, I just want to second what Esther just said about refugee admissions. 100%. I completely agree with that. I'm actually going to go in a slightly different direction. When Amitai first reached out to me about this project, What We Owe Others, I thought about a story or two, and I'm going to tell these stories very quickly, and bear with me, I promise you that there's a point to this. My daughter, Caitlin, is 14, and she hates cigarette smoking. I mean, really hates cigarette smoking. I might say that she hates cigarette smokers, but that's a little harsh. She's just 14-year-old, and she's a nice girl, but she really hates cigarette smoking. I remember the first time we encountered someone smoking a cigarette. She was 4, and she had never seen a cigarette before, so she was one of the, 4-year-old. What's that? Why are you doing that? What's this? We went on vacation last year, and I explained to her that she was likely to encounter lots of people in France who smoke, and that she must resist the impulse to walk across the cafe and snatch the cigarette out of their hands, which I know she wanted to do. She means well. Frances Willard, if any of you know who she was one of the leaders and founders of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the late 1800s. The WCTU, they had a wonderful motto. I wrote this down because I couldn't remember this. Moderation in all things healthful, total abstinence from all things harmful, which seems like a fine idea. Their great achievement politically was the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, which prohibited the sale or consumption of alcohol in the United States. Over the course of the 1920s into the early 1930s, we know now what the effect of prohibition of alcohol was. It was the explosion of the production of unsafe alcohol, which killed far greater people than consumed alcohol when it was produced legally. It also, of course, created a huge criminal enterprise, which caused massive violence throughout the country, and so prohibition was repealed thanks to the 21st Amendment. And we look back on that period as a great mistake, I think, most people, and yet we do, and yet we have modern prohibition, which incarcerates millions of Americans for the committing of minor offenses. What we can say about Frances Willard and others like her is they meant well. They meant well. I'm a libertarian. I love human liberty, and I hate people who would deny others their liberty. George W. Bush, the 43rd president, also loved liberty and hated tyranny. He pledged, of course, in his second inaugural address to promote and support democratic movements everywhere in the world and to end tyranny in the world as we know it. And he sincerely meant this, I believe this, and he meant well. You get my point. So let me say this. You might say that we as human beings owe it to our fellow human beings to rid them of evils, drink and tyranny and things like that, and even if they don't want us to. I don't say that. What I do say, what I think we owe our fellow human beings as human beings is respect and to treat them as individuals, to not treat them by virtue of their race or their ethnicity or their religion or their country of origin. They are human beings. Every single 7 billion people on this planet deserve that. They deserve the right to their lives and their liberties and their bodies. And we owe it to them to respect that. So I'll close with this, not very original, I'll admit. Y'all have ever heard of the book, Everything I Ever Learned, ever needed to know, I learned in kindergarten, right? You heard of this book? There's a long list of things, including cookies and milk, which, yes, I love cookies and milk, but there were 3 things of that long list that really stand out for me. What we owe others. Don't hit people. Don't take their stuff. And clean up after yourself. And I think we all, as human beings, owe our fellow human beings at least that much. And that's a lot. Thank you.
Well, before we go on, this is too precious. Not to stop for a moment. So first of all, you very much lived up to the reason you're here, so I'm delighted. I was counting on you to express a view different. The whole idea
You're welcome.
is to have different viewpoints. But I really like to hold your feet to fire just a little, very gently, with full respect.
Gentle fire. Yes,
and
gentle.
that is, well, would you have stopped the Holocaust? Would you have done anything in Burma? Let's look at some concrete situations.
Right.
Are there exceptions, excepting your kindergarten rule and all the others that follow? But are there exceptions? And if yes, how you tell when you make exceptions?
Sure.
And when it's just
Sure.
an uncalled for interference?
Right. I think the challenge for Americans in particular is that we do mean well. And we believe, and not unreasonably, that we have enormous power to do good. But as you probably know, many years ago I wrote a book called The Power Problem, and the gist of it is when you have a big hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And this gets to the point that Esther made, a separate point from the refugee issue, is we need to take account of all of the power and influence that we have as a nation, and much of that power and influence is not wielded by the U.S. military. It is not wielded by the U.S. federal government. It is wielded by individuals and NGOs and private organizations. And so the question really is, when we say, what do we owe others, it is, what do we mean by we? And I think Esther picked up on this. What do we mean by we? And I think as individuals, we have a lot more power and influence than we give ourselves credit for. And that's where I would focus my attention.
Cheers.
Okay. Well, I think we're discovering some themes here, so that's going to be interesting. What do we owe others? Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me. It's such a stimulating topic, and it's something in some ways that I work on in my work every day, but to be able to step back and consider this as I did maybe when I was a grad student in philosophy, to think about the implications of the philosophical underpinnings of this question for really hard policy questions that we have to face today in Washington is really quite a gift. So this is something, a question that has been discussed and debated by philosophers and religious scholars for centuries. But as you can start to get a sense here, as well as from the questions that Professor Etzioni sent us, it's a somewhat narrower focus tonight. The we in question seems in many instances to be the U.S. government, and the other people are people in other countries. That's sort of where we're headed here. So this is more of a foreign policy discussion than a philosophical one, and as somebody who left a career in academic philosophy to become an activist, I'm all for that. I'm happy about that. In my work, I draw inspiration for how to answer that question from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which celebrates 70 years today. It's this pivotal document that was drafted in the wake of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. And on the question of what do we owe others, it provides, I think, a lot of insight and an ideal to which I think we ought to aspire. It enshrines a comprehensive list of fundamental rights that all people have by virtue of showing up on the planet. And when the United States signed that document, it pledged to help promote respect for those rights in order to secure them for everybody. And we can talk about what that means in practice, and we will, but I think it's a good framework for how to think about this question because it's both moral and pragmatic. As Esther was saying, I think I tend, being somebody who works on policy in Washington, to make the pragmatic argument more often than the moral argument. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sounds like a lofty document of ideals that fuzzy-headed people put together to build a utopia, is really a security document. We should all go back and read it. It's not that long. But it basically says, look what a mess we made of the world. How are we going to make sure that doesn't ever happen again? The way to do it is to recognize the inherent dignity of all individuals and pledge ourselves to respect and uphold their fundamental rights. I just came back last night from Arizona, where I was for the McCain Institute's annual forum. I serve on the board of Senator McCain's Institute, and he often talks about how his favorite book is Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, which of course takes its title from those profound words of the poet John Donne. And I'm just going to read them very quickly. No man is an island entire of itself. Each piece of the continent is a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So in some ways, our question tonight, what do we owe other people, seems to deny that interconnectedness, in the way, and in the context of U.S. foreign policy, it kind of suggests that to help non-Americans is somehow to deprive Americans. But as Esther was pointing out, instability, war, other human rights emergencies are really a potential threat to all of us, sitting right here. All of us meaning in the personal sense, not in the broad metaphoric sense. And that's the lesson that we learned in World War II. As President Roosevelt pointed out, freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. So I don't want to push this point too far because, after all, as Wai Wai pointed out, the Rohingya are enduring unspeakable horrors and atrocities, and most of us are carrying on just fine in our day-to-day lives, and it doesn't seem to affect us at all. But so the immediate threat might seem distant, but in a broad sense, we're all really passengers on the same ship. And if you doubt that, think about global warming. We should have a dialogue about that. So if the we in what we owe others is indeed the United States, then I would say we owe the world a lot. We owe a lot, first of all, because we take a lot from the world in terms of resources. And we owe a lot because of our enormous influence, even if it's diminished now. There's no question that there is no substitute for the leadership of the United States. We should help other people in part because we can. It's not a very fashionable view, actually, right now, that, on the left and the right. Many on the right want the U.S. to turn inward and take care of Americans. And on the left, I can tell you that a lot view this human rights rhetoric as just a smokescreen for invading other countries. But I think history teaches a different lesson. There are lots and lots of examples, from the Marshall Plan to Reagan's support of democracies in Eastern Europe, leading the effort to build the system of international law and institutions to enforce international law, President Bush's efforts on AIDS funding for Africa, on and on. Lots of examples where the U.S. has stepped in and messed with other people and done good and saved a lot of lives, raising the level of living for millions and millions of people. And there's a reason why activists in other countries always ask for American support. For them, it's not an academic question, as you heard from Wai Wai. They know firsthand that the U.S. can make a real difference between life and death, freedom and repression. There are lots and lots of instances, you heard some of them, but you can all list them, when the United States did terrible damage around the world because it meant well. There are lots of examples like that. But I don't think they negate the positive examples. They show, rather, that the choices that the United States makes and how it chooses to use its power matter a lot. So how should it do that? Well, first, and I take your point, Chris, humility. Start with humility. But after that, I'm kind of a, all of the above type person. We should use every tool in the toolkit. Diplomacy, development, assistance, public pressure, military force if we have to, treaties, and on and on and on. Interpersonal, I take that point as well. I think there's a lot we can do as individuals. But I don't think individuals could have stopped the Holocaust. So I think, but right now, I think maybe we agree that the balance of the mix of that toolkit is off. There's too much emphasis on military force. There's been lots of instances where the use of military force, the no-fly zone, say, to protect the Kurds after the Gulf War, that's one example that saved a lot of lives. But we have special forces now in over 100 different countries, and we do have this hammer and nail sort of problem. So that's gotten worse under President Trump, I think. He's not an isolationist when it comes to military power, but he's sort of an isolationist when it comes to everything else.
Right, soft power.
And so, and in some ways, by the time a problem needs military force to solve it, we've already tragically failed.
Correct.
When the choice is between a bad one and a worse one. What we owe other people is to try to prevent those crises by fostering respect for human rights. That's the wisdom of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Addressing human rights violations before they become human rights emergencies. That means putting conditions on military assistance, moral and financial support to activists, and engaging in diplomacy with friends and foes. And it means really fundamentally leading by example. When we live up to our own ideals, it puts pressure on dictators and it builds bonds with democratic movements. And when we fall short, it just gives cover to dictators to do terrible things. So it's no coincidence that virtually every repressive ruler right now, from Sisi to Putin, Duterte, they're all launching their own war on terror as a pretext for expanding power and cracking down on dissent. I really want to agree with what everybody else said about the refugee crisis. This is something that Human Rights First has been working on for 40 years, and the U.S. has been a real leader. There was a consensus that taking in refugees was actually good for the United States, and it was good for the world. And again, we're seeing without American leadership that system is just falling apart. We're squandering our credibility and abdicating our leadership here in the worst refugee crisis since World War II. It's hurting all those people, but it's also hurting us. And this fixation on blocking Muslims from entering the United States is playing right into the hands of ISIS and other terrorist groups that seek to depict our country as hostile to Muslims, and that is hurting our security. So if nothing else, I would say I think we can agree that, and it sounds like maybe we do, that at least for people who are running for their lives, we owe them our protection.
I just, before I ask you a very short clarifying question, I should mention about the refugees. There was a point where the Democrats wanted to increase the number of refugees coming in from Syria, and the Republicans said that they had to be vetted, and they were too dangerous. So I suggested that we bring in 25,000 Syrian children, aged 10 to 3. They are not security risk, and they would be with us during the war, and after the war they return. And there's a precedent for that. That's what we did for the Cuban children. Yes. And there's, of course, the kinder transport. That's what was done for Jews. Right. And I got a Congress member who drafted the bill, and he got one vote in favor of allowing children to come to the United States. So the refugee situation is really terribly troubling. The one I want to ask you briefly, you rely on Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You're, of course, aware, but not everybody in this room, that includes socioeconomic rights. So are you picking and choosing? Are you just say, I like civil legal rights, but never mind this other stuff? Or are you willing to accept the full text?
Well, I think that absolutely we accept the full text. But if you take a look at the Universal Declaration, as Amitai was just saying, there are a bunch of articles that relate to civil and political rights and the right to be free from torture and the right to self-governance and all of this. And then there are what are called economic, social, and cultural rights. And these relate more to education and welfare and healthcare and language and those kinds of things, which are framed more as aspirational, but also are very difficult to say whether, when is someone's right to health care being fulfilled or protected. It's much harder and really relates a lot more to resources. But I think that the wisdom of the Universal Declaration, it's strange because, of course, it was in some ways the post-World War tensions between countries are reflected in the Universal Declaration. And yet, 70 years later, when we look at it, we really, I think now from terrible experience, see that in practice, those rights really are interconnected. That it's true that when there's deep inequality and unfairness in societies, or when people feel marginalized or discriminated against, that leads to conflict. That's a reminder of when people can be made to feel less than, when they are treated as the Rohingya have been in Burma, then that is what leads to conflict. That's the ultimate wisdom of the Universal Declaration. But boy, it's hard in practice. But having conversations like this, which will help us grapple with those real world questions, and a lot of them have to do with resources, where are we going to put our resources, I think is a very healthy step.
Great. Thanks, Amitai. And Arena Stage, it's wonderful to be here. I'm used to being on your side, looking down on the stage. It's a very unusual experience for me. I wonder whether I should break out in song, but you,
That's for later.
you would not want that to happen. And in fact, I'm going to try to be short because I now stand between us and having the dialogue with you all, which is really what we would like to do. We're here to facilitate the conversation and maybe say a few things that would get your minds going. So I do want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Everybody in Washington is busy. Monday night is when you would probably just as soon stay home and recover from the weekend. So thank you all for coming out. We look forward to the discussion. Some of the discussion has been quite philosophical, maybe because it's the lawyer in me. I'm going to try to be a little more, not lawyerly, but just more concrete in a couple of things that you can maybe try to latch on to. I will give you my bottom line. I do feel that the United States should, to some extent, be our brother's keepers. I believe that we do have humanitarian obligations around the world. Part of that is because we are the United States. We are a country that has certain basic values that we do not just hide here in the United States and focus on ourselves. We are interconnected with the rest of the world, but we are also a country that is built on values that includes concern for others, and that has been the history of our country. Some of that is for altruistic reasons, for purely humanitarian reasons. Some of that, and the two things can come together, as Esther says, can be for national security reasons. If we ignore humanitarian crises around the world, poverty, genocide, instability, it's not only bad for the people who are there, and we're shirking our humanitarian and moral obligations, ultimately it can be bad for us as well. We let these problems fester, and it can be a real problem for us. I can tell you I've spent a lot of time when I was in the National Security Council listening to the CIA talk about where the next crises are going to be around the world. So I think we do have a humanitarian obligation. The what how and where do we exercise that obligation? So let me try to break that apart. We are not trying to make the world in our own image. I think this is the point that Chris is making, and we've had problems when we've tried to do that. I think there are certain universal values, but trying to figure out what those are difficult. I think other countries have got different treatment of women, different treatment of voting and democracy. I think, certainly for all of us should be able to agree that women should be treated equally. It's hard to tell other countries precisely how to do that, but I don't think we should just ignore the problem altogether. Everybody would like to be able to be treated equally, and that means having a democracy and a vote. And so I think rather than just ignoring democracy around the world, that means that we can encourage democracy, encourage the free press, encourage women's rights. So I don't think we should just ignore those issues, but it can be difficult if we have too heavy a hand. What I really want to focus on before I turn it over to you all is where there are real humanitarian crises, humanitarian catastrophes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities. What should the United States do about that? Do we just ignore those things and say, that's something that's happening in another country, it's too bad, but we're just not going to do anything about that? I would like to think that there is not a person in this room who feels that we can just ignore all of that. Now, part of it is that bad things happen every day in the world, and we can't go and police all of it. So when do we go and police these things? Let's talk about some of the examples that Amitai mentioned, and we'll talk about the one that's been most recently in the news, Syria. Should we have intervened in Syria? As a policy matter, I think it was a close call, but I think probably so. Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people really crossed I'm not going to use the word red line, but I'm going to say it violated a really important human norm. I don't like to think of the United States as the world's policeman, but on something like this, if a country uses chemical weapons against its own people and just the rest of the world allows it to happen, I think we do not deter others from doing that. We did try to exhaust other remedies. The Russians vetoed the Security Council resolution. We did end up acting with others the second time, which I think was better than the strike that the Trump administration took a year ago in April, so we acted with the French and the British. So on balance, I think that was an appropriate intervention as a policy matter. I worry that Mr. Trump may have been motivated by not a humanitarian impulse, but more by a political impulse to distinguish himself from his predecessor. But I think that that was an appropriate example of intervention. Similarly, President Clinton's intervention 20-some-odd years ago in Kosovo, where there had been ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, again, the Security Council refused to authorize intervention, and the United States, with NATO partners, intervened in that case. Libya, I'm inclined to think, was a mistake. I think that the United States and the Europeans went in too soon. It was not clear to me that there was going to be a genocide or an ethnic cleansing or the mass human rights atrocities that have occurred in some of the other cases. Maybe this is just a case of hindsight because it didn't work out well and it's easy to criticize later. I think we jumped too quickly in Libya. And of course, this is an example of Colin Powell's pottery barn rule. You break it and you need to fix it, and we didn't. And Libya is now much worse off, I think, than it ever used to be. Two last points. One, and Amitai will glare at me if I go into too much detail, but as the international lawyer in the room, my last job was the senior international lawyer for the U.S. government. We try as Americans to comply with law, and international law actually prohibits the use of force in another country for a humanitarian purpose. The United Nations Charter was set up after World War II really to respect the Westphalian, very state-focused system to protect states and not so much to protect individuals and human rights. And the only authority that the UN Charter allows to use force from one country to another is either in self-defense, if you are protecting yourself from an attack from another country, or if authorized by the Security Council. So it's actually not authorized under the UN Charter for one country or a group of countries to use force even for a humanitarian purpose. This has created a really interesting sort of cognitive dissonance amongst human rights lawyers, of which Elisa will tell you in particular, because human rights lawyers, particularly international human rights lawyers, like to think of themselves as being international lawyers committed to the rule of law. But the UN Charter says you cannot intervene in another country for a humanitarian purpose. So if you're concerned about human rights, but you're concerned about international law, then what do? Well, the easy textbook answer that one is taught in school is, well, you go to the Security Council will act swiftly and promptly and altruistically and will pass a Security Council resolution that authorizes the use of force. And of course, we all know that doesn't happen. So what do you then do? Do you say, well, international law doesn't allow us to intervene, or do you intervene in those rare circumstances where you think that even not strictly authorized by international law, that it's appropriate? What the Clinton administration said in Kosovo and what the Trump administration has said, they're really not quite so clear yet, but I think they're tiptoeing up to it, is to say that these interventions in Kosovo and in Syria were justified. Not that they were legal, but that they were justified. So I guess the bottom line is, to take Chris's point, I do think we have to be cautious about trying to remake the world in our democratic image with all of our values, although I do think that there are certain values that are universal, and we shouldn't just say, well, we're only going to have women's rights at home or democracy at home or a free press at home. I think those are things that we can push on. I think we cannot intervene every time we see a wrong in the world. As Elisa said, there is a whole toolbox of things that we can use. I don't think we should immediately intervene in Myanmar because we are unhappy about ethnic cleansing, but it may be that it is time for a return to economic sanctions to try to apply more pressure after sanctions were lifted originally on Myanmar. So there are a number of things in the toolkit. But at the end of the day, and these are the hardest cases, when there is a genocide, where there is a Holocaust, where there are hundreds of thousands or millions of lives being lost, or, and admittedly, these were a lot fewer lives being lost, but it was a serious issue where you have a country using chemical weapons against its own people, and that's why I say it is a close call. I do think that military intervention can be appropriate. I don't think the United States should go alone. I think we should work in coalitions. And it does, as an international lawyer, cause me cognitive dissonance here because it isn't strictly permitted under international law. So I'll end with that.
I just discovered that I do not want to be a moderator. I would love, oh my God, I want more just, never mind legal. Anyhow, I can't see the mic, the light is my face. There are mics on both ends.
There are people in the we should turn on the house lights,
Great.
right?
Yes,
We should turn on, yeah.
Yes.
Can I say one plug for another institution, and that is the Holocaust Museum here in town has a new exhibit that just started, and it is about the role of America in the lead up to the Holocaust, what we did, what we failed to do. And it just reminds me about, we spend so much time arguing about should we militarily intervene here or there, and, we talk and talk until the house is on fire, and then there's really very little we can do. Mm-hmm. Syria started with a peaceful demonstration looking for additional democratic rights, not even to overthrow Assad. And then when a couple of teenagers wrote some anti-Assad graffiti on the side of their school, they were arrested, and they were tortured, and one of them was killed, and it didn't seem like any of our business. So we didn't do very much, and we didn't say very much. Fast forward now, 7 years later, and it is a massive tragedy not only for the Syrian people, but for all of us. So these terrible atrocities often start with a single violation of someone's fundamental rights.
Can I just pick up on that?
Thank you.
I was just going to quickly pick up on that point about also speaking up. One is paying attention, and I'll say all of us here are actually paying attention to the fact that we're here. And then that speaking up, because even within the horrors of the Syrian crisis, the escalation of refugee outflows was foreseen. The World Food Program came to all of the major donors, publicly said, we are running out of money, we're running out of food, the neighboring countries are full, we need help. And all of our countries didn't increase the budget, didn't supply any resources, could see it coming a year in advance. So there are things we can do even in the middle of the crisis to increase our commitment and take actions. Those that we owed a serious response. We're the largest donor, and we didn't do it.
It's very well put. Just one sentence. If you read the problem from Power's book on all the genocides, you see that in all the genocides, those who committed them first tested the waters.
Yes.
They first want to see,
Yes.
and when we did not respond, they took it as a green light.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Hi, thank you to everyone for sharing. Christopher, I have a follow-up question for you. I liked your example of the French smoker who wouldn't like a cigarette pulled out of their mouth. I couldn't agree with that more. But how would you have us react and either intervene or not in situations where we are being asked for that assistance? As Wai Wai mentioned,
Right.
they came to the U.S. government
Right.
wanting that. It's not us imposing what we think is best. How would you react to that?
Well, I think, first of all, that matters, right? So when the assistance is requested, that is significant, and it's a consideration. To John's point, because international law is founded on sovereign states, when the assistance comes from the state in question, from the recognized government, then that has higher authority than when the assistance comes from a non-state actor within that state or an insurgent group. And that causes complications. Not least because in our history, we have had many people come to the United States and appeal to us for help. Some of those people were sincere and had the best intentions and genuinely represented a movement within their country for peace and justice. Others weren't. And this gets to our question of humility and a certain element of sort of skepticism, a healthy skepticism. That doesn't mean that we never accept or we never respond to requests for help. But we have to recognize that some people are going to tell us what we want to hear. I remember so well because it was one of those moments in the early time when I was at Cato, when President Bush gave an interview with the head of Meet the Press, passed away, Tim Russert. He gave an interview with Tim Russert in the Oval Office, and he said, Mr. President, you keep saying that democracy in Iraq is going to result in the preservation of human rights and the flowering of a democracy, a true democracy, a liberal democracy. And he said, Tim, yes, that's right. I know that's true because they told me. And Russert said, Mr. President, who told you? Well, these guys, the three guys that were in the Oval Office with me. And again, he had every reason to want to believe they were telling him the truth. They were not. They were not committed to creating an Iraq that respected the rights of all Iraqis. They were not. And so I think we have to, again, in the interest of advancing human rights, which we are absolutely committed to, we have to be sensitive to the danger that in trying to accomplish that end, we will undermine it. And Alyssa's right. Just because we've had some bad sort of results doesn't invalidate the good ones. But it does call for a certain amount of introspection. And and so lastly, it's a long answer. We want to have a dialogue. You don't want to just hear from me. I do think that in addition to Colin Powell being known for don't break it, or if you break it, you own it, he was also known for the Powell Doctrine, which had a set of criteria that sort of spelled out. And one of those critical criteria is part of just war theory. You enter into an intervention, you have to have a reasonable expectation that you're going to succeed and that you're actually going to make things better. And if you can't do that, then it is immoral to initiate force without a reasonable expectation that you're going to make things better.
I have a question for Elisa and Wai Wai regarding the Rohingya situation. Because I am confused. It seems to me that in the Myanmar situation, if there are any terrorists involved, it's the Burmese military. That's the terrorists. They're the ones that have been basically after the civilians. They're hurting civilians. Most of the people running to Bangladesh are not military. They are civilians. So the definition of a terrorist is that they are hurting civilians. So my question is, why is the UN now involved in repatriating Rohingyas back to Myanmar when there is no guarantee that they'll be safe there? And why? How can America, in its with ideals such as, they will fight for human rights everywhere, how can they still say that they believe in that when they let this kind of situation go, basically continue? Because it was 700,000 a few months ago and now it's 1 million. How can we justify that?
Elisa?
Well, I would defer to
I'd
Wai
like
first,
to
and I'm
hear
happy to add.
I'd like to hear from both of you.
Sure.
Because you have different viewpoints.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's opened up lots of questions. I would like to address firstly about the narrative of terrorists. The persecutions of Rohingya is not a new thing, actually. And I believe U.S. government is aware of it even before 20 years, like since 1990s. The Rohingya are basically an indigenous populations from Burma. They were a citizen of the country. They had all rights as other citizens. But the persecution, the policy against them, making them others, started from 1962, and there was like operations against the populations, like abuses, intensive abuses over the populations happened a few times in the history since 1976. So there was, in 1976, about 300,000 people had to flee from Burma to Bangladesh, and they were able to return under the UN facilitation. And there was another exodus in 1990s, and they were able to return. And since 1990s, the policy over this population has increased. Basically, they are not even able to go outside of their village, and they cannot go to the hospital without permission. They cannot go to this. The kids cannot go to the school and university. If they can go to the university, they may not get a degree certificate. And all the Rohingya public servants were systematically, basically resigned one by one. So there is no public service from the Rohingya community after 25 years now. Before we had soldiers, we have generals, we have police, we have judges, we have parliamentarian, we have everything. But now even no cleaner or no clerk in a public institution. This is how the persecution has systematically happened since at least intensively since 1990s. Since then, we have approached again and again to many different all over the world, all corner of the world to all government, including U.S. government. And there was country political transition in 2011, and in 2012, there is the rise of nationalism. And then there is a conflict happened between Buddhists and Muslims, which is actually facilitated, orchestrated conflict. And then it's become intense with the rise of Buddhist fundamentalism or extremism. And then in 2016, there was a group of Rohingya guys attacked the police post according to the national news. And the government immediately labeled that as a terrorist organization. But there is no such thing until now exists. We don't know where are they and where is exist, and they never had actually targeted the civilian. They basically attack, even if they attack the public, the government, the police stations or military post, and then with that event, the government say there is terrorist attack, there is a threat. And they just clear up all the Rohingya villages and push all the people back. Push to the other country, to the Bangladesh. So this is where the terrorist narrative when it's come to the Rohingya. So it's become a global phenomenon. The government is using as if they are Muslim, if they have arm, or if they use any violence attack, and they immediately become terrorists. So this is where they're applying this global narrative to their own domestic politics and use as an excuse basically to wipe the entire community out of the country. So basically, when we go to the to your questions, I think the all UN or governments or even United States government, when they act on the issues like this, mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, it is very important that they respond in a responsive manner. Not that they know everything and now we will help you or we will protect you with that manner, being as an expert or as a brother. But I think this is very important that they respect the community who they are going to help. So there is something lacking in my experience of activism, which is, as I said, as you bring up, which is respect. Respect to the people in that country or in that community. What they have to say, what they want. Okay, when they seek for justice, it means they have their understanding of justice. What does that mean by you have to listen it? You cannot just say, okay, now if you want justice, we will bring you justice and we go forward with our own way. No, it doesn't work. It will create more harm. So it is very important that they react on the do no harm principle. And it can be only done with respect. And I have been seeing, and it applies to the UN as well. Sometimes their usage, their interfering, their activities, they harm basically because they don't listen to the people who are affected. And when it comes to the country like United States or the powerful countries, and I feel like most of the time they are not really, they do act on the thing that they want. They do listen the thing that they want to listen. So when we came and talked to the U.S. government in the last few years, 5-6 years, and they said, this is not the time to talk about this thing. They don't want to listen these crises. They don't want to listen these processes that we are worried, we're concerned, because they believe that this is success story for the United States. Now you have democracy, everything is done, and this is just one issue. It can be solved gradually. And it's basically become human tragedy. And I think this is the most important, that when you can hold your government accountable by really not allowing just only act on the things that they want to act, mostly based on their political interests or economic interests. But it should be the interest on the human protections and human level.
So let's hear what Elisa has to say, because I'm curious. Why?
I can have just one sentence to add to that, really. One is that they're returning people who are refugees back to places where their lives or freedom are threatened is a violation of international law. That there are not a lot of things that are black and white in international law. That is one of them. So, well, that's not black and white at all. But we work on that every day. And the second thing is that I mentioned how governments often use this narrative of terrorism to crack down on people they don't like. But I will say this, if you wanted to create terrorists, this is the way you do it.
That's right.
I'm on strict orders to finish this on time. In effect, there's a trap door under the stage, and come 8 o'clock, you are going to disappear. So why don't we take all the questions together, and then we have a last round.
I couldn't help but notice there was more than a few references to the Holocaust, which brought to mind the country that tries to guilt trip people to support them currently is deporting African refugees and sending them to Europe. And also we'll not get into their abysmal cruelty towards the Palestinians. And another country that is one of our great allies in that region, Saudi Arabia, has not taken in one refugee, despite the fact that they're religiously, culturally, and ethnically similar. And as for all these interventions, how many of them have really truly been humanitarian and for human rights and democracy? Or were they really about geopolitical interest? We have supported some abysmally horrible dictators in Latin America since the early 70s. Actually, they might have done it even earlier than that. Yes. The Saudi royal family. You talk about a country where living life as a woman is pure hell. I think Saudi Arabia is pretty close to the top of the list.
Is there somebody else there?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your interventions. I'm interested in hearing more about sanctions. I realize that military intervention is often important, and I was happy that some of you brought up sanctions, but talking about moral versus legal obligations, the U.S. already has a large number of very well-regarded international measures for enforcing some type of sanction on actors in other countries. The Global Magnitsky Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, there is various other tools and resources for that. But I happened to be at a meeting on anti-corruption measures this morning, and the big complaint is lack of enforcement. Well, I think the U.S. is very highly regarded in this measure, more so than most other countries, but still the number of cases that are brought is very small. Mm-hmm. So what needs to be done for more attention to be paid to this? Since it is a very cost-effective measure for putting people on notice, it has also served American interests directly, because you're undercutting, corrupt enterprises and kleptocrats undercut American commercial interests abroad. So there seems to be a no-regrets strategy there. And specifically in the case of Myanmar, it seems that when they opened up the country in the transition period, I heard from some people that were working there that some of the sanctions, the SDN list for that's managed by the Treasury, which has the specially designated nationals on it, it changed very rapidly, and sometimes there was a lot of questions for why certain people that were very clearly involved in crony capitalism and involved in the old regime were so quickly let off the hook with very little public involvement. So I have some questions about why that happened so quickly, and has there been any measure to put them back on there?
I just wanted to go back to I think one of the first points that was made in the evening was the Wai Wai's description of her first experience in jail, when she started talking to and listening to the other prisoners in the women's jail. You realized you owed those people a duty to tell them they had rights, to educate them in their own rights so that they could understand what it meant to be free. And I think this is a comment, not so much a question, but I think one of the underlying things which Americans and West, and this sounds kind of a bit imperialist, I understand, but we still have an obligation to large parts of the world to educate people maybe by our own example, but in what it means to be democratic and free, but also to listen to other people, to figure out how they can accommodate themselves to enhance their own freedom and their own well-being. So it's not a one-way street, I think. That's an important thing. We owe it to have a two-way street when we're talking about these issues. But one final comment on the kindergarten. I found it a very fascinating example. However, I never went to kindergarten. Lots of people in the world, I think probably 6 billion of the 7 billion people in the world, never went to kindergarten. Right. They may have gone to other forms of very, very early education. But they would probably have learned slightly different versions of what you said. The irony is that what you said, if you apply those rules to the world community, you'd come up more or less with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we run out of time. We're going to go the other way. Each one of you has a sentence. Last words.
I'll take the sanctions one then, because I think there is a range of actions that the United States can take when we see bad behavior around the world that we don't want to simply let stand. Several of us here, Esther and I in particular, have spent much of our careers in the U.S. government. The problem about most of these international problems is, there's never an easy answer. It's usually choosing between, bad solutions, and there's always a downside. But when the United States does see some humanitarian problem in the world that we don't want to ignore, obviously military intervention is not the first choice. Direct diplomacy may be the first choice. Multilateral diplomacy through a group may be the next choice. Sanctions is very important because it can have an effect, but it doesn't happen quickly. It can take years for sanctions to have an effect. It has had an effect on Iran. It has had an effect on North Korea, but neither of those countries are where we want them to be. I do think with respect to Myanmar that we have tried direct diplomacy, we've tried multilateral diplomacy, that we now may need to return to a form of coercive action that will have some effect. And then lastly, on enforcement, the problem is that it's generally blocking the assets or the transactions of particular individuals, and we occasionally catch people who are engaged in those transactions, but it just doesn't happen all that much. So enforcement, it's not really lack of will, it can be very hard to catch people, but the U.S. government is quite serious when we do catch people engaging in these transactions. We enforce the law.
Briefly, please.
Yes. So I very much take the point of the first question. Are these interventions really humanitarian, or are they really cynical for other purposes? I mean, Iraq is probably the biggest foreign policy nightmare of my generation, and I think one of the reasons that we actually could not muster public support for earlier intervention in Syria is because of the PTSD that our country is in after the Iraq War. So there's an example of consequences from not being humble. And some of those consequences mean that we aren't able to do what I think we should have done in a massive humanitarian crisis. So I think you're but Bosnia, but there are others where we have been more humble, and as Churchill said, after exhausting all other possibilities, we did the right thing. on the sanctions also, it's music to my ears to hear someone say the words global Magnitsky. Most Americans have never heard of that sanctioned regime. My organization actually is spearheading dozens of anti-corruption and human rights groups to put together dossiers of, let's just say, people who we think are very well deserving of sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act. And in fact, this current administration is now working on its second tranche of sanctions, and there are some really bad dudes on that list, and it's a really great thing. So there's a lot more that we can do, and part of it is to educate Americans about the powerful tools that we have.
Very quickly, we have an obligation to model the right behavior. That right behavior begins by not demonizing people and inaccurately and unfairly calling them terrorists, which other countries around the world pick up on. Refugees are not a threat to the United States of America. We should speak that loudly and strongly. The evidence on this is overwhelming. If you doubt me, visit the Cato website, and my colleague David Beer has done an enormous amount of terrific work on this, so please, thank you.
I must say that one of our strongest tools is diplomacy. That in order to actually follow the sanctions regimes, in order to actually convince other countries that they should take more refugees, if, in addition to our example, is having the experts on the ground around the world who are building those relationships that allow us to exercise these tools, and making those long-term investments, as I indicated in the beginning, in things like education that actually help the next generation. So if I were to say one tool in which we really need to invest, it's diplomacy.
Thank you. Thank you to be here again, and I just want to see what you can do after this event. I think there are a few things that you can do. The most important thing you can do is, firstly, try to understand the situation. If I say situations of Burma, try to go to the website and read one article today, and then see how you can respond. There is a few ways that you can respond. For example, sharing these articles and sharing among your friends and colleagues in your environment. At the same time, responding in many other efforts, like, for example, providing humanitarian aid and support to the people, and and also raising awareness more bigger way, and pushing your government to really take actions on accountability and human rights, and such as and using their the existing mechanism that U.S. has, legal mechanisms such as sanctions on like individual sanctions on businesses, and there is actually a discussion beyond that happening, like in terms of like blind general sanctions discussions around that even happening. So, listen and then try to respond whatever way you can, financially and with your knowledge and with your resources, whatever you have, and by using all means. Thank you.
Wai Wai Nu, I wish I could send you back with more. We are humble, as we've been told. You certainly have my support in any way I know how. Would you all help me thank the panel, and especially Wai Wai Nu? Thank you for coming. I hope to see you on May 29, same time, discussing the future of race relationships in the United States. Goodbye now.